hurts when you hurt somebody.
I think that one of the loneliest and perhaps strangest places on earth is an emergency room in the middle of the night, particularly during the time of COVID. I had the very distinct pleasure of spending some time in one when I was about 1 week postpartum. You should know that my birth story was not destined to be featured on TLC. It was not heartwarming and sweet. It was kind of traumatic, although it does have a happy ending because I had 2 healthy, beautiful boys at the end of it. But my first week home from the hospital was equally unpleasant. For some unknown reason, I could not stop throwing up. My mom was staying with us. She's actually a labor and delivery nurse, and she had no answers. She couldn't figure out, what was going on. And after about 48 hours, I looked at her and I said, "Am I dying?" She said, "Okay, we're going to the hospital." So we packed up. My husband and my mom and I went. It was about 10 o'clock at night. And because of COVID restrictions, they were not allowed to come in. And so I was sitting there in the freezing cold waiting room. And if there's a particular kind of cold in a waiting room, I don't know what it is. Maybe it's because you're vulnerable and don't feel well. But I was sitting there freezing by myself with a barf bag, just feeling totally miserable. My mom and my husband were standing outside. There was these large glass windows, just kind of like peering in, like very anxiously, maybe a little creepily. In fact, the lab tech came to take my vitals while I was sitting there. And he says to me almost under his breath, "Don't look, but there's a woman standing behind you trying to see these numbers." And I was like, yeah, that's my mom for sure. I watched as people came in these like varying states of health. There was what appeared to be an older man, probably in his 90s, whose son had dropped him off. He came in a wheelchair. He seemed like maybe he had some dementia. He was on the phone with who I presume was the person outside, trying to navigate the system, trying to figure out how to ask for help. There was another woman who came in. I presume her husband brought her in. She was in a wheelchair. She was literally moaning in pain. And I remember thinking, this is actually inhumane that these people are by themselves. Like, relatively speaking, I was fine, minus throwing up all the time. But I remember thinking, these people should not be alone. They need help. They need someone sitting next to them. And there is something so deeply wrong about seeing someone who is in pain and who's by themselves. But yet, even in spite of that, many of us avoid people who are in pain. Why is that? Today, we are wrapping up a series we've been in for the last 3 weeks about how to be a good neighbor called The Art of Neighboring. And we've done this series once or twice before because it's so close to the heart of who Eastown is, to love our neighbors where we live, where we work, where we play. And when we did this in the past, it was a 3-week series, but today is a 4th week, so you can kind of consider today a bit of a bonus episode of the podcast. If we haven't met, my name is Lisa. I normally lead music here, and I've been around church my whole life. I've served in lots of different ways, but this is actually my first time giving the message, and it might be the last, depending on how today goes. So welcome to this little slice of history today. Today I want to talk about a particular kind of loving our neighbor, and maybe it's even the most important kind. It's the kind that we offer to somebody when they are in pain. I believe that Jesus calls us to be people who move toward people who are in pain. In week 1, we looked at the story of the Good Samaritan, and we're going to go back to that story today, but look at it from perhaps just a slightly different angle. And the big idea is this: we need to become the type of people who move toward people who are in pain. I'm going to say that again. We need to become the kind of people who move toward people who are in pain. And for context, when I say pain, I'm not necessarily referring to physical pain like the man on the side of the road in the story that we're about to read, although certainly that could be part of it. Maybe it's someone you know who's going through a messy divorce. Maybe it's someone whose kid has been diagnosed with an illness. Maybe it's someone who's lost a loved one. Today we're talking about the capital P, pain, and that comes in all sorts of forms. So we're going to look at this passage together. It's Luke chapter 10. On one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. "Teacher," he asked, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" "What is written in the law?" he replied. "How do you read it?" He answered, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. "You have answered correctly," Jesus replied. "Do this and you will live." But he wanted to justify himself, so he asked Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" Other translations, instead of calling him an expert in the law, call him a lawyer. And I am married to one of these people, and I can tell you that they will do those annoying things like, well, who is neighbor? In reply, Jesus said, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and when he was attacked by robbers, they stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So too, a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii and gave him to the innkeeper. 'Look after him,' he said, 'and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have.' Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers?" The expert in the law replied, "The one who had mercy on him." Jesus told him, "Go and do likewise." Now, before we skip right to talking about why the Good Samaritan is the obvious hero of this story, I want to spend a little bit of time in defense of the other guys, which is controversial, I know. I think these guys oftentimes get a bad rap, and I'm not trying to say they did the right thing, but in reality, I get it. I get why they did, why they walked on the other side of the road. I think it's not that difficult if you really put yourself in the shoes to understand that. A professor of theology once said, if you find yourself as the hero in any of Jesus' parables, you're probably reading it wrong. Because in reality, I'm often like them. I get them. There are reasons why we choose to avoid people who are in pain. There's a verse in Psalm 38. There's an Old Testament poet, David, who writes, "My friends and companions avoid me because of my wounds. My neighbors stay far away." So this is not a new problem. That was written maybe 4,000 years ago, and we still continue to do that. Some of these reasons, let's look at these reasons why we might avoid people. Number 1, we don't know what to say. I think this is probably the number 1 reason we avoid people who are in pain. We don't want to say the wrong things, we just don't say anything. The second reason might be we don't feel qualified. I can imagine the priest and the Levite seeing the man on the side of the road who clearly needs medical attention, thinking, well, I'm not a doctor. I don't have anything. I don't know what to do. And I know this is us at times. You might think, well, I'm not a pastor, or I've never gone through something like what they're going through, so what could I possibly have to offer them? The third reason is it's awkward. And I think one of the biggest reasons is that it is awkward is because we come face to face with this reality that it doesn't make sense why they are going through this terrible thing and we aren't. It doesn't make sense why terrible things happen to people. We spend so much time crafting our lives, living in such a way that we can avoid pain and try to keep our lives on track. And then we come face to face with another human who probably was doing all of those same things. And yet this terrible thing, this diagnosis, this tragedy has happened to them. We have to confront our own frailty and our own humanity in that moment. And that's sometimes awkward stuff. The fourth reason might be that we assume someone else is doing it. To put myself in their shoes, they might have walked by and said, you know what, he's probably already called 911. His traveling companion went for help. We can look at someone, sometimes particularly people who seem to have a lot of people around them and go, someone's reaching out to this. I have personal experience. I remember a friend of mine who seemed to have so many people around them that surely they went through this really horrific thing in their family. And I reached out and learned that I was one of the only people that had reached out to them, which shocked me because I was like, surely there's people clamoring at your door to be of service, but that wasn't the case. So we've identified some of these reasons that we don't move toward people who are in pain. And my guess is that you've thought or said at least one or maybe all of these things. And if you have, you're not alone. That's human. But now we're going to pivot and look at the reasons why we should move toward people. And I'm going to keep it simple because there's really just one. And if you grew up in church in the 90s, you will know why. It is WWJD. These bracelets pictured here were the height of fashion. And clearly I know fashion in junior high because this is me in a windsuit. We can go on from that slide. We just move past it to the next one. Yeah. But they were kind of ubiquitous. I mean, even celebrities, LeBron, Kanye, have been seen wearing these bracelets. And there was a reason that they were so popular, because it was a really simple statement of what would Jesus do? And that is the reason that we should move toward people who are in pain, because that's what he did time and time again. Just a couple of weeks ago, Evan talked about the woman who'd been bleeding for 12 years. There were all sorts of reasons why people culturally and for religious reasons would not have moved toward this woman. But Jesus doesn't do that. He sees her, he moves towards her, he heals her. There's a story in Luke 17 that there's 10 lepers, people who have leprosy. And in biblical times, leprosy was used to probably encompass all sorts of different skin diseases. And there were all sorts of reasons, again, culturally and religiously and medically, why you would not move towards someone who had leprosy. But Jesus doesn't. He doesn't stay away. He moves towards them. There's a story in Mark chapter 5 about a demon-possessed man who's literally roaming through the graveyards, the cemetery, and cutting himself with rocks. This is someone who people were kind of afraid of, and who we would probably describe as, in our time now, having a mental illness of some kind. And no one wanted to be around him. He was all alone. But Jesus doesn't avoid him. Jesus moves towards him yet again. There's a woman in John chapter 8 who's caught in adultery, who feels deep shame. And that's what the religious leaders want to do, is just shame her even more. Jesus moves towards her and sees her. When Peter denies Jesus 3 times right before his death, and this is kind of a particular kind of pain, because this was self-inflicted. Like, Peter, you did this to yourself. You did the thing you said you weren't going to do, and you made a fool of yourself. And Jesus, again, moves towards him. Doesn't cut him off. And Jesus was the one that was most wronged by it. One of the names for God is Emmanuel, and we talk about this word a lot at Christmas time in particular. Emmanuel means God with us, for God to be with. Psalm 34:18 says that the Lord is close to the brokenhearted. He doesn't stay far away. He moves in, he moves toward. Why is this so profound and such a beautiful truth? Because pain is lonely. Pain is an inherently lonely experience. There's an author, John Green. I recommended this book to Clint, and he thought it was too dark. And I was like, maybe that's just my personality. I really loved it. It was called The Anthropocene Reviewed. And he shares about a time when he had viral meningitis, a symptom of which is a terrible headache that he described as a consciousness-crushing omnipresence. He says, anyone who has ever been in pain knows how alone it can make you feel, partly because you're the only one in your pain, and partly because it is so infuriatingly and terrifyingly inexpressible. In other words, language falls short in these times. He says, hearing about pain we do not feel takes us to the limits of empathy, the place where it all breaks down. I can only know my pain, and you can only know yours. But this is where the person of Jesus changes everything. Because not only does God promise to be with us, but the good news of Jesus is that he not only knows our pain, but he takes it onto himself. I love how the Message translation says this verse in Hebrews chapter 4, verse 15. Now that we know what we have, Jesus, this great high priest with ready access to God, let's not let it slip through our fingers. We don't have a priest who is out of touch with our reality. He's been through weakness and testing. He's experienced it all. This is one of the things that differentiates Christianity from all of the religions, is that we have a God who took on human flesh, came and experienced what we experience, and knows our pain, who moves toward us. To move to somebody who is in pain is to simply say, you are not alone. And is that not the truth of what Jesus came to tell us? To put on flesh, to be a God who is not far off, but a God who draws near. 8 years ago, I was working at a large church in another state, and I was in a very visible role. I was on stage a lot, and I had been for many years, and I was getting divorced, which is awkward for church people. I knew that word was starting to get out about this. Have you ever been in a situation where you were actually hoping the rumor mill, the gossip mill was like working in your favor? Just so like, can you get it out there so I don't have to be the one to tell people that was me? Like, can you just all talk about it amongst yourselves? And yet I would walk around on Sunday morning, and no one was saying anything to me. It was like crickets. I was prepared for someone to say something dumb. I was like ready for dumb. I was braced for dumb. I had a sassy retort prepared for dumb. But no one said anything. And somehow that was worse, because I felt invisible in the place that I should have been the most seen and the most loved. And And in my own way, I could identify with the stories that Jesus told of people who are in pain, feeling isolated and feeling alone. Until one Sunday, someone who I knew, not super well, just came up and said, "Hey, I heard about what you're going through, and I'm really sorry, and I'm praying for you." And that was it. And honestly, it is now a core memory for me. And I remember thinking, there are two types of people in the world. There are people who move toward people who are in pain, and there are people who don't. And I'm not saying this to shame anyone who doesn't. Again, all the reasons that people don't are very human reasons, and I get that. But I want to be somebody who moves toward people who are in pain, even if it's messy, even if it's awkward, because they will remember it. I actually just reached out to this guy yesterday. I was like, you probably don't even know this or remember this, but this was so impactful to me. And you didn't say anything profound or try to fix it. You just said, "Hey, I'm sorry, and I'm praying for you." When we move toward people who are suffering, who are in pain, we most likely do not have the tools or resources or words to fix or solve anything. But when we move towards them, we remind them that God exists and that God is near to them. Now, you might be thinking, great, I'm on board, but I still don't know what to say. I still don't know how to help. And so with the remainder of our time today, we're going to talk about some practical tips of what to do and what not to do. And I will let you know that these tips are from someone, an author named Kate Bowler. And she, at the age of 35, was diagnosed with stage 4 colon cancer. And she wrote a really beautiful and profound book called Everything Happens for a Reason and Other Lies That I've Loved. And you should definitely read it, because if you've ever gone through anything, you will resonate with a lot of this. So things not to say. Well, at least, fill in the blank. No. You don't get to silver lining their pain. They get to do that if that helps them get through, but it is not helpful for anyone for you to try to show them the silver lining to this very dark cloud of their life. The second thing not to say is, it's going to get better, I promise. You don't know. It might get way worse. Way worse. They might die. You don't know. You don't know how it's going to end up. So don't promise things that you can't promise. This one is reserved particularly for someone who has lost a loved one. God needed an angel. No. This makes God look sadistic and needy and is very theologically unsound. So do not offer that up to anybody. The fourth one being, everything happens for a reason. This is intended to make people feel as if there's a great cosmic bow that will tie all of this up. And there isn't. A lot of times, it just doesn't make sense. And that is part of the human experience of pain, is things do not make sense, and we don't have to try to tie it up with a bow. The fifth one is not necessarily something to say, but not to say, but don't try to use the opportunity to mine for information about their experience, about their journey. You might want to just be satisfying your own curiosity, you get the tea, and it's easy to do this and think that you're caring, but really check your heart and say, am I doing this for my benefit or am I doing this for theirs? Because if it's for yours, they're going to know, and they will not receive that as love. The truth is, there really is nothing that you can say that will make things better, but you can offer solace. You can offer light to someone who is in a really dark place. You can throw a little anchor to somebody who feels like they're drowning. So here's some suggestions of things that you might say, and you can tweak any of these to, figure out how that would work for your context and the situation, the person that you're facing. One is, I'd love to bring you a meal this week. Can I email you about it? Don't make them answer on the spot. And if you don't cook, you can DoorDash. That's the beauty of it. I grew up in church in the South, and there is not much that a cheesy carb can't at least improve a little bit. So if you're going through it, and sometimes the last thing that you can do when you're really in the middle of something is to think about food. It's like this basic human thing that you as a person can say, let me provide a meal for you. That's a small thing that I can do. Another thing you might say is, I'm so grateful to hear how you're doing, and just know that I'm on your team. If someone has chosen to bring you into their pain in any kind of way, treat that as the sacred gift that it is. The third thing is just, oh, friend, that sounds so hard. Just acknowledging this sucks. That's just empathy. And that's just basic, that just helps someone feel seen and go, yeah, this is not great. The fourth thing is silence. You don't have to say anything. John Green in that book also shares about a time he was a chaplain in a children's hospital. And he received what I think is profound advice, which was, don't just do something. Stand there. So often our tendency is to try to jump in and fix or say something or do something. And sometimes the greatest thing we can offer someone is presence, just to be. Sit with them and watch old episodes of The Office. Just let Michael Scott make a fool of himself and laugh and take their mind off whatever thing that they're going through. If we go back to the story of the Good Samaritan as our guide, he sees, he has compassion, he moves toward, he bandaged his wounds, he put him on a donkey, he brought him to an inn and dropped him off. That's something I actually really love about this story. He used the things that he had. He had some oil and wine. Apparently he had some bandages. He had no special skills. He wasn't a doctor. And then he didn't actually take it upon himself to try to solve everything. He didn't upend his life. He takes him to an inn and says, okay, Tag, you're it. I'll be back later. But does what he can do in the moment and doesn't seem to feel guilty about the fact that he can't stay with him for the next week or anything like that. He was, as we like to say here at Eastown, he was strategically placed in that moment to respond and to be God, to be Jesus to this man. Here's the bad news. You are not qualified to fix or heal or solve most things that people are going through. But here's the good news. Have you ever experienced any kind of pain? Have you lived on this earth for approximately 2.2 seconds? Are you human? Great. Now you are qualified to be somebody who shows up, who moves toward. And one more thing before we close today. Maybe you're somebody who you're walking through deep pain and you're wishing someone would see you. And if you feel alone in that, let me just say I'm so sorry. And anybody, Clint or Michael or myself, anyone on our leadership team would love the opportunity to be invited into whatever thing that you're walking through, to pray with you, to sit with you, just hear a bit of your story. So our big takeaway today is be somebody that shows up. Be a person who moves toward, even if it's awkward, even if it's messy. Take the pressure off of yourself to have the perfect thing to say, because there is no perfect thing to say. Offer a prayer, offer a meal. People will remember it. Become a people who move toward people who are in pain. I'm going to pray for us. God, thank you so much for your model of us in this, for the ways that you move toward us when we are in pain, that your scripture promises that you are close to the brokenhearted. Whatever thing that means, that's a terrible diagnosis, that's a loss of someone we love. Maybe it's an ongoing depression. Maybe it is family relationships that are complicated and hard. Lord, thank you that you are the high priest who is not out of touch with our reality. That you do not remain far off, but you come close. Lord, help us to become those people, to be good neighbors in the way that we show up when things go off the rails in someone's life. Help us to be your hands and feet to your presence, to the world around us, God. That is how we are a part of bringing your kingdom on earth as it is in heaven. It's in your son's name. Friends, we're going to take communion together now. And this is one way that we remember that Jesus came. He had his body broken on our behalf. He was betrayed. He felt alone. Experienced some of the worst physical pain imaginable. So he knows what it is like to suffer pain. We have the elements on tables that are in the back. I believe there's gluten-free on this table over here to your left. And as we sing this next song, you can go back and grab the elements and then come back to your chair and just hold on to them. And April will lead us in taking those elements together. But we remember on the night that Jesus was betrayed, he took the bread and the cup and he said, "This is my body, this is my blood, broken and shed for you. When you do this in remembrance of me." So as I said, as the band starts to sing, you can go and grab the elements and they'll go hang on to them until we're ready to take them together.